Hi, I'm Shauna and this is Shauna's World, and I'm recording a video today for World Mental Health Day on the 10th of October. I've spoken a bit online before about my mental health, and I just kind of wanted to get the conversation going with Mental Health Day to normalise talking about mental health and mental illness, because the more we talk about it, the less stigma there is. So a bit about me. I'm an adventurous person. I love the outdoors. I love hiking, running, bushcraft, camping, yoga. There's many facets to me. So I'm a loving daughter and sister and friend and girlfriend. I do all the things that anyone else does. I love my job at MSF as a fundraiser. I am also studying to be a breathwork facilitator on the side and a forest bathing guide. I do a lot of wonderful things, but I also happen to have a mental illness called Complex PTSD. You've probably heard a bit about PTSD, it's quite well known, and the common symptoms with PTSD are anxiety and nightmares and flashbacks, so kind of reliving the trauma that that person has been through. PTSD usually happens after a singular trauma, and it's quite a common reaction. Now, complex PTSD is a little bit different. So it generally occurs when there have been multiple traumas or a prolonged trauma over a period of time. And it's all that trauma compounded that creates complex PTSD. So it's often caused by developmental trauma like abuse or neglect in childhood, or it's less often diagnosed in adults and generally comes from things like abusive relationships or trafficking. So it generally comes from situations where you feel trapped, you feel like there's no way out, and there's this compounded trauma from being in a kind of trapped situation. Complex PTSD, which is also known as CPTSD, has a lot of similar symptoms to PTSD, but it has some extra symptoms as well. So one thing is finding it really hard to regulate the emotions, difficulty with relationships, feeling excessive amounts of guilt and shame, re-traumatization, so putting yourself back in situations where the trauma might happen again, emotional flashbacks rather than kind of visual flashbacks, so thinking your nervous system and your emotions feel like you're back when the trauma's happening, but it's not in the same way as PTSD that all of you feels like you're back there. And also dissociation, so just completely shutting down. So I've had a lot of treatment, and while I've felt all of those symptoms at some point, some of them are virtually non-existent now, but some of them are still kind of a big problem. So for me, dissociation is one. I can completely check out of a conversation and have no idea I'm doing it if something triggers me, which means I feel like I just forget chunks of my life, which is really annoying. It took me literally years to get a diagnosis from when I first became unwell. So I feel like my mental health was never that great. I struggled with self-harm from a very young age, but I never really thought it was a problem. But I first went to the doctors when I experienced some really bad psychosis. Now, I cannot describe how completely horrible the psychosis was. It changed my entire perception of reality. Like, everything I knew to be true wasn't real. And I thought I was in a parallel universe where I was just reliving my trauma over and over on repeat, with things just getting worse and worse and worse. And it was going to continue for all of eternity, even after I died. It was just horrible. I also thought no one was real, so that the whole universe was in my head and I was making everything up. So it felt like there was just no way out of this. I always thought, when I'd heard about psychosis, surely you would know it's not real because you have logic from before the psychosis. But honestly, it changed everything. So you know that feeling when you are having a dream and it all feels real and it feels like that's your life, but then you wake up and you're like, oh, okay, it was just a dream, none of that matters, it's all superfluous. So when I went into my first psychotic episode, it was that same feeling, but it was like I'd woken up from my entire life up to then, and my entire life had become meaningless, and all that was real was this new horrible reality. I just can't even describe how horrible it was. So I did go to the doctors then, which was really difficult because I didn't think that I was ill. I thought mental illness was made up to get me to believe that I hadn't been in a parallel universe, but I didn't think the people who were telling me that were real. So it was all very complicated. And when I went to the doctors, that was like a first positive step. And I got put on antipsychotic medication, which made a really big difference. And I'm so grateful that that happened. But it definitely wasn't the end of my journey. It would actually be another 10 years before I got my CPTSD diagnosis. And in that space of time, I had several psychiatrists, 2 changes in medication, lots of re-traumatization, some A&E visits, a bit of therapy that didn't work out, and 1 hospital stay. And I still didn't get a diagnosis. My psychiatrist at different points tried to diagnose me with different conditions, from bipolar disorder to schizophrenia to borderline personality disorder and acute polymorphic psychotic disorder. And then he would eventually say, no, it doesn't fit. I don't think that's the right symptoms. And then eventually he said, I don't think we need to diagnose it. Just, it is what it is. And a diagnosis isn't going to be the be all and end all. And in all that time of him asking about my symptoms and asking what was wrong with me, he never asked, what's happened to you? And I never brought up my trauma, because partly because I had so much shame around it, but also because I didn't realize it had medical significance. Because in medicine, we so often treat the body and the mind differently, and I didn't think it was a medical thing. I just thought what happened. I didn't know my nervous system was responding to that. I never really told him about my other symptoms that might have identified it as CPTSD as well, because it was things like guilt and shame and trouble with relationships. And I didn't think it had medical significance, because I was just like, well, that's just a personality trait. That's nothing to do with anything that a doctor might be able to help with. I also really took being brave through all my trauma as a badge of honor, and I made a point of kind of being really blasé about everything. And I just I never realized how much it was impacting me. So it was only a couple of years ago now I got my diagnosis, and it was when I realized that what I'd been through wasn't normal, and it wasn't okay, and it had really affected me. And then I kind of spoke to a doctor about it. Since then, I've had so much more support, because having a diagnosis means you know the kind of treatment you need. So I've had a lot of therapy. I've had 2 months as an inpatient in a trauma clinic, which was incredible. And I've taken a more holistic approach to my healing as well. I have seen real benefits from EMDR, which is a type of therapy that kind of helps you process the trauma with eye movements. And I've done sensory motor psychotherapy and somatic experiencing, and I found that so beneficial. My lifestyle has changed so much since I got my diagnosis, and since I started focusing on really putting energy every day into regulating my nervous system and making sure my nervous system comes first. So I practice breath work every day. I exercise pretty much every day. I meditate quite a lot. And I've given up alcohol, which is a huge thing. That's made a massive impact. Eating well, getting as much time in nature as I possibly can. This stuff all makes such a difference to my nervous system and to managing my symptoms. Staying well is a constant effort. I feel like I'm constantly juggling and balancing and trying to get the right balance, but I feel like I've mostly got it down now with a lot of practice. Having said that, I do still struggle quite a lot. Like, I get triggered by not just words and images that are like really obviously remind me of trauma, but really tenuous things that you wouldn't think would be triggering can really set me off, and I might just dissociate or just feel really terrible. But I kind of know how to handle that now. A lot of the symptoms may never go away, but I feel in so much of a better place to handle them now. I hope this gives a bit of an idea of what CPTSD is and the effects, and for anyone else who's struggling, hope that you can lead a really happy, positive life with CPTSD. The world is definitely getting better at talking about mental health. In the years that I've been struggling with my mental health, I've seen things change so much in the conversations people are having. But I still think there is a lot of stigma around mental illnesses, and especially around certain mental illnesses, and specifically psychosis, which I think there's a real lack of understanding around, and people are maybe a bit afraid of it. But I really feel like we're moving in the right direction. And I just think it's important to talk about this stuff as much as possible, to smash the stigma and to normalise talking about mental illness as normally as physical health. I want it to be as normal to say, do you know what, I'm really struggling today, my mental health isn't good, as it is to say, oh, I've got a headache today. That is what we should all be aiming for, because we all have mental health, and I think it's so important to acknowledge that. And we all have our ups and downs, and whether you have a diagnosed mental illness or not, we all need to take care of our mental health and our well-being. And if you do have a mental illness, there is help out there, and it might be a bit of a struggle to get it, but I'm so grateful for the support I've had. And yeah, just happy World Mental Health Day. Keep talking. Let's get this on the agenda of as many people as possible and normalise talking about mental health. Thanks.